When we posted the meme, "Autism isn't a disorder, it's the most advanced neural divergence to ever exist," Facebook absolutely lit up. In less than 3 weeks, it had over 6,000 reactions, with over 99% of those being positive. It had over 300 comments and nearly 1,200 shares. Now, most people got what the meme meant straight up, but a vocal minority, they didn't just disagree with it, they were absolutely triggered by it. Not by what it actually said, but by what they thought it said. And that reaction, well, it proves the point why autism memes like this are needed. This video isn't a rant, it's a breakdown of why this meme hit so hard, why so many people misunderstood it, and how the current narrative around autism was built on circular logic, vague science, and a dangerous myth called normal. So if you've ever felt like the label you were given doesn't fully explain you, or worse, keeps you stuck, then what you're about to hear will change the way you see everything. Because once you start to spot the lie behind the label, you'll not only reject the disorder, but you'll start to reclaim your true design. So let's go inside and start to break this meme down sentence by sentence. Sentence 1. What they call autism isn't a disorder. Let's start by clearing something up. The struggles faced by those labelled autistic, emotional dysregulation, sensory overwhelm, social challenges, executive dysfunction, are absolutely real. That's not up for debate. What is being questioned here is the automatic leap from "these struggles exist" to "therefore it must be a medical disorder." That leap is made so often and with such casual authority that most people never stop to ask the most basic question: where's the actual proof? Not anecdotes, not circular definitions, not professional consensus. I'm talking about hard proof. There isn't any. To believe autism is a disorder, you first have to believe in something called normal. But what is normal? Is it the statistical average, the cultural ideal, the behavior of the majority? All of those are arbitrary. And worse, all have been weaponized. Left-handedness was once called a disorder, so was homosexuality, introversion too. Any deviation from the mainstream has, at some point, been labelled pathological. Autism is no different. The logic is simple. If your behavior doesn't match the cultural standard, you must be disordered. But difference does not equal dysfunction. Difference is just divergence, and divergence challenges the idea that there's only one correct way to think, feel, or behave. Now here's where things get more interesting. The DSM-5, the Psychiatric Bible, lists 297 mental disorders. Not one of them can be detected with a medical test. No blood work, no scan, no physical marker. What we're diagnosing isn't biological malfunction, it's behavior that doesn't fit the mold. But because the word disorder implies something physically broken, people assume that's what's being measured. In reality, autism is labelled based on social deviance, not physical defect. And the logic behind the diagnosis, it's circular. People are told they're autistic because they behave a certain way. Then they're told they behave that way because they're autistic. That's not an explanation, it's a linguistic trap. It creates the illusion of understanding without offering any real insight. This is what I call the diagnostic illusion, the idea that naming a cluster of behaviours somehow explains them. But naming something isn't the same as understanding it, it's just putting a label on a pattern. Things get even murkier when you try to define autism as a mental disorder rather than a physical one. Swapping adjectives doesn't improve the argument. If the disorder can't be located in the brain or measured in the blood, and if its definition relies entirely on the presence of the label itself, then what exactly are we diagnosing? The answer is an idea, a socially reinforced, untested, and largely unquestioned idea. Let's take this one step further. In order to create diagnostic criteria, researchers needed to study autistic people. But to know who was autistic, they needed diagnostic criteria. That's the original catch-22. The criteria were built by observing people already labelled as autistic, using assumptions that were never verified, filtered through the subjective interpretation of researchers, and then voted into existence, literally voted. There is nothing strictly scientific about that. Yet the resulting criteria became the foundation for services, for funding, for research, for pharmaceutical treatment, and most importantly, for personal identity. People start to believe the diagnosis defines them, when in fact, it was a category built on circular logic and institutional convenience. What we're looking at isn't medicine, it's a system built on assumptions, reinforced by repetition, and propped up by the illusion of authority. And the result? Millions of people convinced they're broken, not because of what they experience, but because of how that experience has been interpreted. When people are confronted with the lack of physical evidence for autism as a disorder, they often pivot to genetics. Autism is genetic, they say, as if that settles the issue. But even the National Institute of Mental Health, one of the most cited authorities on the subject, doesn't make that claim. What it actually says is that the causes of autism are unknown. It offers vague language like may involve genetic and environmental factors, or genes appear to play a role. This isn't conclusive, it's speculative, and phrases like maybe, likely to, or appears to are not the language of scientific certainty, they're hedges. They sound authoritative to the average reader, but don't say anything definitive. Yet these non-statements are repeated by clinicians, social media influencers, and even parents as if they were proven fact. They're not. One of the most commonly cited pieces of evidence for the genetic argument is the concordance rate in identical twins. If one twin is autistic, the other is more likely to be as well. But here's what rarely gets mentioned. If autism were purely genetic, the concordance rate in identical twins would be 100%. Identical twins share 100% of their DNA, yet many pairs have only one diagnosed twin. That fact alone breaks the case for a purely genetic cause. Instead, the studies fall back on terms like increased risk or higher likelihood, phrases that suggest a connection without proving causation. It's a subtle form of persuasion dressed up as science. Others point to the idea that autism runs in families as proof of heredity. But that logic doesn't hold either. There are plenty of people diagnosed with autism who have no family history of it, and even if there is a pattern, we need to account for shared environments. Families share far more than just genes. They share emotional atmospheres, belief systems, social norms, parenting styles, even types of stress. All of these shape a child's nervous system and behavior, and none of them require a genetic explanation. Then there's the appeal to brain differences. Some studies show that the brains of autistic individuals differ from the norm. That much is true, but those differences are inconsistent. They don't appear in every case. They don't show up early enough to suggest they cause the traits, and they vary widely from one person to the next. So what if these differences aren't the cause of autism but the result? Chronic stress, emotional overwhelm, and social disconnection all change the brain over time. That's what neuroplasticity is. The brain adapts to the experiences it's exposed to. So if a child spends years in survival mode, overwhelmed, misunderstood, or isolated, those adaptations will show up in the brain. But those changes are symptoms of lived experience, not signs of an inborn defect. What's being presented as evidence of a disorder may in fact be the neurological footprint of prolonged emotional chaos. And until that possibility is seriously considered, every study that shows a difference risks mistaking consequence for cause. Let's talk about how language shapes belief, often without us realizing it. When you see phrases like studies suggest, research indicates, or genes may play a role, it's easy to assume you're being told a scientific fact. But that's not what those phrases mean. They're not conclusions, they're implications. They're designed to sound authoritative while leaving legal room for denial. Supplement companies use the exact same tactic. Supports immune function, helps promote brain health. These phrases avoid making direct claims so they can't be challenged. Autism research and mental health websites often do the same thing. The language is engineered to persuade, not to prove. It manufactures belief through suggestion, not through science. Now ask yourself, why is this kind of wording everywhere? The answer, as usual, lies in the money. Since 1980, pharmaceutical companies have paid over $80 billion in fines for criminal behavior. Fraudulent claims, suppressed data, bribing doctors. These aren't isolated scandals, they're a pattern. And guess who helped write the DSM, the very manual that defines autism? Nearly 70% of the contributors had financial ties to pharmaceutical companies. That's not a footnote, that's a conflict of interest on an industrial scale. On top of that, 60 to 75% of psychiatric research is funded directly or indirectly by the pharmaceutical industry. Studies backed by pharma money are 4 times more likely to show favourable outcomes for drugs. Negative results often go unpublished, Ambiguous data gets spun as positive, and many of the websites people trust for autism information are either backed by pharma-funded foundations or linked to drug industry lobby groups. What looks like education is often marketing, and in that ecosystem, you're not the beneficiary, you're the product. Here's the real game. If they can convince you that autism is genetic and unchangeable, they've created a customer for life. A genetic condition suggests permanence, and if it's permanent, it needs lifelong treatment. Lifelong treatment means recurring revenue. That's the model. It's not about healing. It's about subscription-based management of human suffering. The more convinced you are that your condition is fixed, the less likely you are to question it, and the more likely you are to depend on the system that framed you that way in the first place. This is why the narrative matters. If you believe the problem is inside you and unchangeable, then you never look outside it, you never look deeper, and you never find your way out. We like to think that facts change minds, but psychology says otherwise. One of the strongest invisible forces shaping belief is authority bias, the tendency to trust someone just because they look or sound official. A white coat, a PhD, an institutional logo. If a doctor says research suggests, most people won't question it, even if the research is vague or flawed. Then there's confirmation bias, the habit of accepting only the information that aligns with what we already believe and rejecting anything that challenges it. For someone who has built their entire self-understanding around an autism diagnosis, any idea that undermines that label feels threatening. So they don't explore it, they defend, they dismiss, they hold on, even if the narrative isn't helping them grow. Before trusting the current model of autism, it's worth looking at the track record of the system behind it. This same mental health system once championed lobotomies as cutting edge. It used electroshock therapy on vulnerable people without knowing the long-term consequences. It locked women away for hysteria. It institutionalized countless individuals based on flimsy, unverified diagnoses. These weren't ancient mistakes, they happened within living memory, and yet the system has never apologized. Instead, it moved on, rebranded, and asked for your trust again. Every generation inherits a new set of labels, wrapped in modern language, but built on the same flawed foundations. And that brings us to the core shift, the recognition that autism is not a disorder. The experiences are real, the pain is real. But the interpretation of those experiences through a medical lens is neither proven nor neutral. It's part of a system that profits from keeping people labeled, confused, and dependent. What gets called autism may be the result of a neural divergence, yes, but one that was amplified by emotional blocks, reinforced by misunderstanding, and locked in place by false narratives. When those blocks are cleared, when the misunderstanding ends, what remains isn't a disorder. What remains is potential, untapped, misunderstood, and waiting to emerge. The system didn't just fail to see it, it actively buried it. The quick question, has the medical model ever actually helped you to make sense of your experiences, or has it just left you with more questions? Drop a comment below and let me know where you stand on this. I read every single one and I reply to them all. Now let's move on to sentence 2. This is the one that people absolutely lost their minds over. Sentence 2. The most advanced neural divergence to ever exist tends to trigger people, but not because of what it actually means. It's often misread as a claim of superiority, as if autistic people are being ranked above others. That's not what's being said. The word advanced here isn't about better or worse, it's about timing. In engine mechanics, advanced timing means the spark fires earlier in the cycle. It's not superior, it's just earlier, and that timing changes everything downstream. Autism follows the same principle. This divergence occurs earlier in development than any other recognized cognitive variation. It happens before the circuits for social-emotional integration are fully online. That early interruption forces the brain to reroute. It builds itself around a different foundation. What emerges is a mind structured for pattern recognition, systemizing, and sensory precision. Not because it's broken, but because it adapted to an overwhelming environment. The divergence is not subtle, it's structural. It reshapes the architecture of thought itself. That's why we see such a wide spectrum of outcomes, from silent brilliance to complete withdrawal. The earlier and more disruptive the emotional overwhelm, the more profound the divergence. Some become pattern savants. Others struggle to speak or regulate emotions, but that doesn't mean the latter are incapable. It may mean they were blocked, cut off from the developmental process most people access through socialization. This is especially important when speaking to parents of severely affected children. The frustration and pain they experience is real, but what's often missed is that what looks like permanent dysfunction may actually be developmental inaccessibility. These individuals weren't born broken, they were blocked from the process that teaches things like language, self-regulation, and empathy. That process is called socialization. It's how we learn emotional nuance, symbolic language, flexible thinking, and our sense of self in relation to others. If emotional overload disrupts that stream early on, the child pulls away and the brain adapts. Not in failure, but in survival. The result is often mistaken for a disorder, but what it may actually reflect is a radical adaptation to an environment the nervous system couldn't safely interpret. Seen through that lens, severe autism stops being a fixed condition and starts looking like an extreme case of blocked development. And what causes that blockage? Emotional imprinting, the buildup of unresolved emotional triggers. Early experiences of overwhelm, perceived threat, and nervous system dysregulation that shut down access to the empathizing path. The moment that path closes, the brain doesn't stall, it reroutes, it systemizes, it starts building a different kind of intelligence, one that the world doesn't always recognize. Sentence 3 and 4, the only thing holding it back? Emotional blocks. When people hear this model, their first reaction is often disbelief. It can't be that simple. Not because it's illogical, but because we've been trained to think of autism as mysterious, unchangeable, and endlessly complex. But complexity isn't always a sign of depth. Sometimes it's just confusion wrapped in credentials. For decades, stomach ulcers were blamed on stress. Sufferers were told to manage their emotions, avoid spicy food, and learn to cope. But everything changed when 2 Australian researchers discovered that most ulcers were actually caused by a single bacterium, Helicobacter pylori. The suffering hadn't changed, the symptoms hadn't changed. What changed was the understanding, and that changed everything else. What if autism is following the same pattern? Today, the medical model still treats it as mysterious and unchangeable, but it's never been able to explain its origin, predict its trajectory, or offer transformation. And yet, people fiercely defend this model because they've built their identity on it. If you've been told your struggles are fixed, then any suggestion they might not be feels threatening. But logic doesn't care about comfort. If a perspective doesn't lead to transformation, it's time to change the perspective. Despite the clinical framing, autism has never been located in the brain or body. No test, no scan, no marker. It's defined purely by behaviours, and those behaviours appear across multiple other diagnoses. They also show up in neurotypical people under stress. They're not exclusive. They're not even consistent across those labelled autistic. That's why some researchers have begun exploring what's called the P-factor theory, the idea that nearly all psychological conditions stem from a single underlying mechanism. I believe that mechanism is post-traumatic stress, not PTSD, the diagnostic category, but PTS, the raw neurological response to overwhelm. PTSD is a label, PTS is a process. Whenever the nervous system is flooded beyond its capacity to cope, it encodes a memory with a negative emotional charge. That memory becomes a trigger later in life, often without conscious awareness. This can happen even without trauma in the traditional sense. It doesn't require abuse or catastrophe. It just requires a moment of unprocessed overwhelm. And that's where the link to autism becomes clearer. Multiple studies confirm that those labelled autistic report much higher levels of trauma and PTS symptoms than neurotypicals, often without recognizing them as such. That doesn't mean autism causes trauma. It means what we call autism might actually be a result of it. But the current model isn't set up to ask what caused the traits. It only checks which box they fit into. What's often missed is that socialization, the core developmental process that teaches emotional regulation, symbolic language, empathy, and flexible thinking, begins far earlier than most people realize. Fetal memory starts forming at around 20 weeks gestation. Even in the womb, the developing brain is absorbing emotional signals, tone, rhythm, safety, and threat. Through the mother's voice, her hormonal cues, and her emotional state, the fetus begins forming expectations about the social world. If those signals are chaotic, tense, or emotionally distant, the brain doesn't wait to interpret them later. It encodes them immediately. And what it encodes becomes the foundation for how that child relates to social interaction. This isn't about blaming parents. It's about recognizing that the developing nervous system doesn't distinguish between a minor disruption and a major one. It only measures overwhelm. And once social interaction becomes associated with threat, the brain begins to pull away. It avoids what feels punishing and redirects toward what feels safer and more predictable. That redirection sets everything else in motion. Human cognition operates through two primary drives: empathizing and systemizing. Empathizing is the instinct to understand people, emotions, motivations, relationships. Systemizing is the drive to understand patterns, rules, mechanics, logic. In typical development, empathizing leads early. It's how children learn to regulate emotions, read social cues, and function in social environments. But when early emotional overwhelm blocks access to that path, the brain doesn't just freeze, it reroutes. It throws the switch to systemizing, not because something is broken, but because it's trying to survive. That survival adaptation comes at a cost. The longer the brain runs on systemizing without access to the social emotional stream, the more entrenched that architecture becomes. It starts building itself around logic, structure, and predictability, not relational nuance. And that divergence isn't theoretical, it becomes physical. Thoughts don't just pass through the mind, they shape it. A well-known study had two groups of piano students. One practiced the fingering pattern physically, the other only visualized it. After a few weeks, both groups showed identical changes in their motor cortex. The lesson: mental repetition sculpts the brain. Neural pathways form around whatever experiences and strategies are repeated. So imagine what happens when a child spends years interpreting the world through structure instead of socialization. Every thought reinforces that neural pattern. Every avoidance of ambiguity, every attempt to systemize emotions or human behavior wires the brain further away from intuitive connection and deeper into rule-based processing. This is how divergence becomes structural. Not because the child is damaged, but because they were forced to build a completely different internal operating system. The problem isn't in the divergence, it's in the mismatch. These systemizing minds are then dropped into a society built for empathizers. They're expected to intuit things they were never taught, to read subtext, detect indirect communication, absorb unwritten rules, and they can't. Not because they're incapable, but because the software doesn't match the environment. This is what we call cognitive mismatch. The friction isn't caused by brokenness. It's caused by trying to reverse engineer a social world without access to the original blueprint. This mismatch leads to failure, miscommunication, rejection, confusion, and each of those experiences creates emotional charge, another block, another trigger. Over time, the person isn't responding to the world as it is. They're navigating an internal minefield of unresolved emotional landmines. These emotional blocks hijack attention, suppress executive function, and freeze emotional growth. They don't reflect the person's potential, they reflect what the person is trying to avoid. And this sets off a vicious cycle. The more blocked they become, the more they withdraw. The more they withdraw, the more social skills they miss. The more they miss, the more awkward or overwhelmed they feel in social situations. Every failed interaction confirms their fear. Every reaction from others reinforces their sense of alienation. Eventually, the system isn't just divergent, it's locked down. The person is not broken. They're navigating life with a system that was never shown how to integrate. What you see isn't dysfunction, it's defense. Sentence 5, remove them, and what emerges is pure brilliance. This is the part where people either light up or shut down. Because when we say that brilliance lies beneath the emotional blocks, some people hear it as fantasy, or worse, as arrogance. You don't know what I've been through. Are you saying autistic people are better than others? That's not what's being said. This isn't about ranking minds or claiming superiority. It's about understanding what gets buried under layers of emotional chaos and what begins to emerge when those layers are removed. Brilliance isn't rare. What's rare is the removal of what hides it. We've been taught to associate brilliance with the exceptional few, child prodigies, Nobel laureates, savants. But brilliance isn't always loud or visible. Sometimes it's subtle. It shows up as clarity, deep focus, creative solutions, or the ability to think without emotional static. It's the capacity to perceive, to refine, to understand systems that others overlook. And that capacity is often blocked, not missing. When the nervous system is no longer on high alert, something profound happens. Cognitive energy that once went into threat detection is suddenly available for insight, intuition, and innovation. This isn't magic, it's neuroscience. Survival mode distorts perception. Safety restores it. When the emotional noise dies down, the real signal begins to come through. And let's be clear, this isn't about saying one type of mind is better than another. The world needs empathizers and systemizers. We need connectors, feelers, stabilizers, just as much as we need engineers, inventors, and deep thinkers. Brilliance lives in neurotypicals too, in abundance. But that's not the focus here. This message is for the systemizers, the ones whose divergence runs so deep that they were mistaken for being broken. This is the equal and opposite message to what we were told our whole lives. You're defective. You'll never be normal. It's a reframing, not from a place of pity, but from hard-earned insight. It's like a parent kneeling down to tell their child, you're not stupid, you just see things differently, and that difference is powerful. Except this time it's not coming from a parent. It's coming from someone who's been there, someone who rebuilt themselves from the same place and knows what's possible. When freed from emotional chaos, the systemizing mind does things that defy expectation. It sees what others miss. It reverse engineers complex systems from fragments. It makes intuitive leaps in logic that others can't follow. It spots patterns across time, space, and context. It innovates in silence while the rest of the world gets lost in noise. These aren't exaggerations. History is full of systemizers who changed the world once their minds were finally given the space to run. Nikola Tesla could design fully functional machines in his mind without sketching them. Temple Grandin reshaped agricultural engineering by applying visual spatial logic to animal behavior. Paul Dirac, nearly non-verbal, decoded the quantum structure of reality. These weren't people who overcame a disorder. They were people who were finally allowed to operate outside it. That's the real tragedy. Not how many are struggling, but how many are dormant, not broken, not failed, just blocked. People who've spent their whole lives trying to fix what was never broken instead of releasing what's been suppressing them all along. The brilliance isn't out there to be added. It's already in there, waiting to be unblocked. Pure brilliance is what lies within us all. Once those emotional triggers are cleared, neural energy flows differently. It stops feeding threat detection and starts feeding coherence, flow states, and gamma wave activity. Those rare, high-performance brain states link to insight and integration. This isn't wishful thinking. This is measurable, and it's accessible. No one can walk that path for you, but someone who's walked ahead can hand you a map. That's all this is. A call to those who've been mislabeled, misled, and underestimated. A message from one divergent mind to another. You were never broken. You were blocked. And when those blocks lift, the world doesn't get a fixed version of you. It gets the real one. So I'm curious to know, what part of this meme breakdown hit you the hardest? Let me know in the comments below. Did it confirm something you've always sensed, or did it challenge a belief you've always had? I'd be really interested to hear your perspective on this. And if you're ready to go deeper, then here's what to do next. Firstly, download my free PDF. Its link is in the pinned comment below. It breaks down our emotional triggers, not a disorder, are the cause of practically all of the challenges we've been told are autism. Secondly, if you want to keep going, then check out this video up here titled Unlocking the Hidden Secrets of Autism Emotional Triggers. This one will bring it all together for you and take you even further.